Okay, welcome to our first algebra video in our flipped algebra classroom. Our learning target for this is 1A1. I can describe independent and dependent quantities in functional relationships. In a minute we're going to look at two of the mathematical words in that learning target, independent and dependent, but first I want to talk about how this should work. So as you can already see, my notes page is a little bit different from yours. I already have definitions for independent and dependent in here. So anything that's different between our two note pages is something you should be writing down. In addition to that, anything that I write down as I talk through a problem, you should write down as well. Now don't forget, you can pause this video at any point to think about what I'm saying. You can rewind it and watch part of it again. If something didn't make sense the first time, watch it again a couple times to make sure you understand it. And if you've done all of that, if you've put the effort in to make sure that you tried to understand something and it still didn't make sense to you, make a note of it over here, okay? Write something down in this question area, and that'll remind you when we get to class to check it out and see if you can ask me about what it meant, and so that it will be cleared up for you. Now let's take a look at this independent and dependent variables. So an independent person is someone who is in control. It's someone who understands what's going on around them and can just take control of it. The variable in a situation that you control is the independent variable. It's the one that is in charge. And so oftentimes, 99% of the time, if time is one of your two variables, then it will be the independent variable. Another way that we can think about an independent variable, it is the input compared to the dependent's output. So for instance, if you think about a Coke machine, you put in a dollar bill, that's the input. It gives you a soft drink, that is the output. Another way to think about independent variables is with cause and effect. So the independent variable is the cause, the dependent variable is the effect. The cause might be you do all your homework. The effect would be you get an A on a test. And so those are various ways to think about independent variables. Time is an independent variable, usually. It's the variable that you're controlling. It's the input variable, or it's the cause. Dependent, on the other hand, is the variable in a situation that relies on the value of the other. It depends on the value of the independent variable. It's the output or it's the effect. So those are all different ways to think about it, and we need to kind of put those into practice now. So let's take a look at this problem 1, and we will kind of walk through this. The first thing we want to do is make sure we know what the variables are in this situation. These are pretty easy. It's obvious that this is one variable and this is the other. So the gigabytes of data, let's use the letter G to represent this variable, and our cell phone bill, the amount of the cell phone bill, let's use the letter B to represent this. So these are the two variables in this situation, gigabytes of data and the amount of the cell phone bill. From here, we need to take a look at how we can think through which one is independent and which one is dependent. And so if you think about it in terms of the independent variable is the one that you control, then you control how many gigabytes of data you use. You can choose whether or not to get on Facebook on your phone. You can choose whether or not to download a new song on your phone. You're in control of that. So this is the one that you control. So let's write control to remind us how we figure this out. So that means it is the independent. On the other hand, this one is the one that relies on the other. So the amount of the bill depends on how many gigabytes of data you use. So it's our dependent variable. Now we want to write a sentence that shows the relationship between these two. I'm going to use the word dependent in this sentence. There are several other ways we might write it, but let's start with this. So we'll say that the amount of the bill depends on the number of gigs you used. So the number of gigabytes used. There's a very simple way to write this sentence. We use the word depends in it to remind us of which is the dependent variable. When you write it in this format, notice that the dependent variable, the amount of the cell phone bill, comes first in the sentence, and then the number of gigabytes used, the independent variable, comes at the end. Let's look at another example and see if we can figure out which is which. So here, how far you can drive and the amount of gas you have. So let's think about which is the cause and which is the effect. Does driving further cause less gas in the car, or does having less gas in the car cause you to drive further? And this is, you could argue both ways on these. That's why these are sometimes confusing. One way I could say is I could say that how far I can drive, let me be very careful on how I say this. How far I drive causes there to be less gas in the tank. But that's not quite what this says. This says how far you can drive and the amount of gas you have. So if there is more gas in the tank, then I can drive further. If there is less gas in the tank, then I cannot drive as far. So as you can see, the cause of how far you can drive is the amount of gas you have. So let's say this is the G gallons of gas, and this is D, the distance you can drive, and this is the cause. And so we will write this as the independent. And then this was the effect. So we will write this as the dependent. Now if this one word, can, had not been there, it would have been then switched. So these you have to be very careful on and read them very carefully. Here's a sentence we can write about this kind of in an if-then format. So if I have a full gas tank. So if I have a full tank, then I can drive further. More miles. And so this is a sentence in which we used an if-then format. And in this case, the full tank is the amount of gas you have, and that's your independent variable, and it came first. So when we use this if-then, the independent comes first, and the dependent comes second. It's the effect, it's the then part of this if-then. So now let's take a look at one more. The number of assignments turned in, and your 6 weeks grade. So I think that input-output is an easy way to look at this. Let's use N for number of assignments, and let's use G for grade. So the number of assignments turned in, you can obviously already see the input here, and the output is your 6 weeks grade. So input and output helps us think through this one. So I could use an if-then, I could use the depends on. I'm going to use a different one that we haven't seen so far, and it'll be fairly common on the way they process things on the EOC. So I'm going to say that your 6 weeks grade, so 6 weeks grade, is a function of, the number of assignments turned in. And this is very similar in format to the depends on. I could have said your 6 weeks grade depends on the number of assignments you turned in. This is more mathematical language to say is a function of. So your 6 weeks grade is a function of the number of assignments turned in. It reads the same way as the depends on, but it's a more mathematical way to say is a function of. Now when they say function here, they have a very specific meaning for it. that we'll get to in a later video. But that's a way that will be very common that you'll see this written. So let's go back and look at our learning target. Our learning target is, I can describe independent and dependent quantities in functional relationships. So now that you've seen this, you should be able to take a sentence that relates two things together. That's the functional relationships part. And you should be able to describe which one of those two things is the independent variable and which one of those is the dependent variable. And that is what we should be able to do now.